I want to take you back to the chalkboard, those pillars of society that I showed you earlier. Just try to think, is any of those solid? Are they being pushed to the full-on collapse? The Cloward-Piven strategy may have just begun with welfare, but it is everywhere now. After welfare, Cloward-Piven shifted their focus to the American vote. I want to show you this. This is Bill Clinton signing in the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. I remember people talking about it. I didn't know much about it at all. I did not know that Cloward-Piven, through Acorn, remember them, were the ones who got that to be signed. Now, check and see if we're feeling any of the ramifications of this law today. What did it do? One, it eliminated many of the controls on voter fraud. Then, it made it easier for voters to register, but difficult to determine validity. Examiners were under orders not to ask anyone for identification or proof to citizenship. That's crazy. States are now required to permit the mailing of voter registrations, enabling anyone to register without having personal contact with registration official. And restrictions were placed on states' ability to prune people who had died, relocated, or been convicted of crimes that made them ineligible to vote. Now, doesn't that seem like it would lead to, 2020? Do you trust the electoral system anymore? I think I got one more in me. And then I don't know. Society, it's almost like somebody is just pushing. So we would declare a full-on collapse of the way we choose our elected officials. We got to come up with something new. And someone will suggest a complete great reset, just like they did with welfare. And that's the entire point. Now, you know the origins, and it didn't begin when Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. The process had been in the works for decades, and Cloward-Piven may not have meant for their strategy to domino across every spectrum of American society, but it's hard not to notice its effect everywhere you look. Look at this. National debt now on pace to top $54 trillion in the next 10 years. Everyone, including the Congressional Budget Office, agrees it's not sustainable. But is anyone cutting the budget? Anyone cutting the spending? Americans can no longer afford groceries. But the government just says, you know what? It's the fault of those dang grocery stores. We're just going to keep on spending, and we'll get after those grocery stores. Record numbers of Americans can no longer pay their rent. But will government alter its fiscal policies? No, they're doubling down. It makes no sense until you remember Cloward-Piven. Push it to the brink of collapse. Now, speaking of collapsing the economy through welfare, Biden just introduced new guidelines. That's what we used to call passing laws, but they don't do that anymore. He just came up with some new guidelines for Medicaid. It now includes cover for rent, utilities, and food. Medicaid. That's full-on communism. I just showed you that record amounts of Americans can no longer pay for groceries and rent. Don't worry about it. The government will take care of all of that. How is that sustainable? Tell me we're not intentionally being pushed towards collapse. And it keeps getting worse. Keep looking through this lens. Re-examine what's currently happening at the border. 2023 was the worst year for illegal immigration ever. But despite that fact, ICE recently circulated a plan to continue releasing thousands into the country. They're not even going to stop them anymore. Just release them. I don't think anybody actually knows how many illegals are currently in this country, but this graph, it says nearly 17 million and growing around 1 million more every year. That makes it bigger than 38 of the 50 states. This graph estimates the illegals are costing us over $150 billion. That number jumped 40 billion just since Obama took office. And speaking of collapsing the system through welfare, 59% of non-citizen households, which includes illegals, are now drawing government welfare. How? Well, 22% of them are just taking cash. 42% are using welfare food programs. 42% are using Medicaid, and remember, Medicaid now includes rent payments. We just had the worst year for illegal crossings ever. How much worse is it going to get? How's your school going to be able to pay? They have to pay more money to teach more people that are here. Hotels are that one hotel is paying $7 million. They're being paid from somebody who $7 million a month to house some of these people. At what point do we just crumble? Well, if you know Cloward-Piven Strategy, isn't that the entire point? Back in a minute. Quickly, I want to just stick with welfare for a second. In 2022, the government spent $1.19 trillion on 80 different welfare programs. Biden's latest budget proposal bumps that to $2.6 trillion. 11.1 million will be added to Medicaid. It's not going to be really. 6.6 million added to Obamacare. What exactly was the point of Obamacare? Wasn't it to lower the cost of health care, or was it something else? Employer-provided health care costs have skyrocketed, more than they have in the last 10 years. And Obamacare premiums continue their Mount Everest-like ascent. Oh, but don't worry, CNN points out the government's going to pay to offset all those costs. Where are these money trees in D.C.? Looking through the Cloward-Piven lens, the point of Obamacare is pretty clear. Millions more are added every year. Prices continue to rise. The government pays to offset those costs. It's a house of cards spiraling towards an unsustainable collapse. Look at the law and order pillar, because on the surface, it makes absolutely no sense what the left is doing to our criminal justice system, does it? They're refusing to arrest criminals, refusing to prosecute. They let criminals go. The result is complete chaos, an implosion of law and order in some of U.S. cities that used to be considered some of the safest in the country, if not the world. But it's not just large cities where it's happening. This is a report from America Analyzed mid-level cities all across the country. They found crime is rising all over Main Street, USA. In Atlanta, homicide investigations have risen by 60%. Burglaries up 31%, vehicle thefts up 22%. Numbers are same in Pittsburgh, Tucson, and Milwaukee. The data is clear. Why are these radical district attorneys and AGs doubling down on their radical criminal justice reform? Why are they pushing law and order to collapse? Unless that's the entire point. Everything is being pushed to the brink of collapse with the explosion now of technology, and there is an unlimited supply, even a bombardment of information available. It's gotten to the point where you're on overload. And the old ways of becoming informed right now collapsing. And the crazy part of all of this is that the mainstream media did it to themselves. Last year, a Gallup poll showed that over half of the country, 53%, said they no longer trust the media. The majority of Americans are not turning on cable news or clicking onto the Washington Post or New York Times. They're going elsewhere. This has led to a train wreck within the media establishment. Last year, media companies cut more than 20,000 jobs, and layoffs continue. Now again, the media turned the American public against themselves. They are responsible for this. But when the collapse happens, the regime has to take steps. The independent media is on very shaky ground right now. Do you think we'll be bailed out, or the mainstream media? News broke a couple of weeks ago that the Biden administration is planning to use artificial intelligence to censor what Americans see, hear, and read. The media so blatantly became a propaganda arm for a left-wing government, it has led to a full-on collapse. Now the question is, what happens next? Blaze, Daily Wire, are we even going to be allowed to exist? I made this chalkboard a couple of years ago, maybe 5 years ago, the final phase. And I said, this is how you know we're in the final phase. These things will happen. Polarization will lead to civil unrest. The critical stage is riots in the street, but riots all over, most likely based on an election. Economic destabilization, Critical stage, banks, stock market, plunge, deflation. But I think more likely is interest payments larger than the DOD, which we hit today, financial collapse of cities and states due to immigration, BRICS reserve currency because we violated international standards when we went to Russia and took them off the international standards. Tech disruption, critical stage, AI, jobs, misinformation, privacy, finance, communications. Then I said, at some point, I don't know what order these come in, but a trust implosion. People will no longer trust the government or media, the justice system or high tech, the education systems or finance or corporations, or the military and police. And the last stage is we no longer trust each other. When that happens, it all collapses. And you have somebody step in and say, I'll fix it. I don't know how we wake our neighbors up, but this one is critical. We've got to still believe in each other and find ways back to each other, because I don't think Democrat or Republican, unless you're a crazy man, is for any of this. Just the regime is.